Welcome to Film Obsessive. I'm Jay Rohr, and joining us is Nathan Wardinski, the author of Dissecting Cannibal Holocaust, an intriguing book that I had the pleasure of reviewing recently. And now we have the author here to help elaborate on the book itself. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So, what's your background? Like, have film studies always been a pursuit, or is that something you came to down the line?
No, it's been pretty steadily a part of who I am and what I've been doing all these years. I attended the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh for my undergraduate degree. I majored in radio, TV, film communication, minored in philosophy and English. And while I was getting that degree, I stumbled into a class on film criticism, and it really changed the way that I talked about movies because I had analyzed literature in my English classes all the time, but I had never had that applied to film. So after completing my undergraduate degree, I went and got a graduate degree. I got an MFA in creative writing. But while doing that, I took courses in film criticism. Uh, there was some terrific classes taught by some great professors there. And while doing that, while I was working on my MFA degree, I started working with a public radio station, 89.7 KMSU FM, The Maverick in Mankato, Minnesota, and started producing a weekly radio program that has now been on the air for 20 years.
Oh,
Um,
congratulations.
and is aired now in a couple of stations in Minnesota. And I play film music and I do weekly film reviews. And then occasionally I'll do special episodes. Like every Independence Day or around thereabouts, I do an episode looking at controversial cinema. So movies that have been censored or banned and celebrate freedom of speech that way. And so, of course, Cannibal Holocaust was a natural fit to talk about. I have talked about it a few times on those special episodes, as well as other kinds of films that were banned and censored for various reasons.
Of course.
So, having been doing this now for 20 years and doing the public radio show and then creating a complimentary website that hosts text versions of all the reviews, I finally wanted to take the next step and write this book, which had been brewing in my mind for some time.
So then that kind of leads right into my next question. Dissecting Cannibal Holocaust is part of a series from the Lexington Books horror studies. And that's got titles like, if my notes are correct, Disney Gothic, Dark Shadows in the House of Mouse, and Future Folk Horror, Contemporary Anxieties and Possible Futures, which I definitely intend on buying and reading soon, among others. There's a lot of titles in that list, all with interesting subjects. Were you approached to be a part of this series, or did you pitch this book to Lexington?
No, I pitched this book to them. Uh, Lexington had put out a call for proposals for specifically for that horror series. And a friend of mine happened to share it on social media. I saw it and I thought, oh, okay, well, I've got this idea for this Cannibal Holocaust book, which I had in fact pitched to other publishers and been turned down for various reasons. Primarily, like if they were not an academic press, they were more interested in a making of book.
Mhm.
And that's not the book I wanted to write. I really wanted to dig into this because I love making of books. Don't get me wrong. I've read and read books and watched documentaries on makings of films, and I find that stuff fascinating. But that's not the book I intended to write. And sometimes I think that the making of books do a little bit of a disservice because they get us talking not about the substance of the film, but about some of the trivia on the making of it. And that's really where I wanted people to shift their view on Cannibal Holocaust, was to not talk so much about the making of it, although that's relevant, but to instead talk about the substance of the film.
Okay. I get where you're coming from. I do see how like you can get lost in the minutia of a production because like that becomes the story,
Mhm.
not the final product. Because like I remember when I was younger, I had the making of Jurassic Park, which was just fascinating to me on so
Yeah,
many levels. And but
I
so
have
much of
those as
that
well.
is, oh, then you know what I'm talking about, where
Mhm.
part of the whole thing is like the trials and tribulations of the hurricane or like
Mhm.
working with them. Oh, we didn't realize the machines would get waterlogged and so forth. And
Yeah.
like that becomes the narrative. as opposed to the actual film. So, what was your first experience with Cannibal Holocaust? Like, did you hear the urban legend first, then finally see the movie? And like, what was your reaction? How did you even see it back in the day? Because that was always a problem. Like when I was growing up, it took forever. I think the first time I ever saw it was like a grainy copy of a copy of a copy on a VHS.
Mhm. Yeah, I first discovered the film through Stanley Weeder's essay, The Most Disturbing Horror Films Ever Made, Disturbo 13. And I actually interviewed Weeder for this book, and he provided a very nice blurb once he reviewed it. But this essay was kind of legendary among horror fans. It was said to enunciate the 13 most disturbing films ever made, and titles included Salò or the 120 Days of Sodom, Men Behind the Sun, the original Maniac, the original Last House on the Left, the original I Spit on Your Grave. This list was published in the early 1990s. And so, having read that essay and all the list of terrible, wonderful films, I then set out trying to see all of them, which took a while because this was the late 1990s, early 2000s. And so we're right at that point where VHS is still a format, and so was DVD. So I went down to my local family video, which was just off campus at the time, and I was able to find a few of those films, but a lot of them were out of print at that point. We now have had this wonderful explosion of on one hand, streaming, and on the other hand, all these boutique labels putting out wonderful 4K restorations of really obscure films. I've heard Kino Lorber is putting out all the Elza She-Wolf films soon, so we have those to look forward to.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I finally got a copy of Cannibal Holocaust through eBay. I wish I'd kept it, but it came in a clamshell box. I think it might have been pirated, but if it was pirated, it was from a good source. And I was sort of blown away by the thing when I saw it because it, on the one hand, was yes, it was what I expected in terms of the violence and whatnot, but it was also so much more. And a couple of years after I got my VHS copy was when Grindhouse Releasing issued its DVD copy, which then was to that point the nicest presentation you could get. And for many cases, it was the only presentation you could get in the United States, although it had been released in the North America on Laserdisc. But and in fact, when I think of it, that may have been where that VHS copy of mine may have come from. Now that I think on it, may have been a dupe of that. But yes, I finally watched the thing on DVD, and that was kind of a revelation, seeing it that way for the first time. It's funny you mentioned seeing it. Many people saw this film as a dupe of a dupe of a dupe. And in fact, that is how one of the actors in the film, Carl York, first saw it. He saw a movie that was a VHS copy someone had passed to him that was multiple generations removed from the original source and just looked like hell. And he kind of dismissed the film at that point, as I'm sure some people did. Although I think that circulation and format suited that movie in a way because it did raise the mystique of it because people were trading it in the same way that people might traffic in illegal substances.
Yeah, because I remember back in the day that was like almost an impossible film to find, which made it's urban legend like blossom more and more because you were like there has to be some reason you can't find this movie, and the same thing with the list of the 13 disturbing films, which kind of brings me to something. You saying that you kind of recognized right away that there was something more to this movie than just like outright gore and shock. And that's interesting because like you see a movie like Salò, people bring that up a lot. In fact, the first time I saw that was at the Gene Siskel Theater here in Chicago. And I was like, why would they be putting this film here? And it was a huge thing with me and my friends because we were like, we're going to get on the L and we're going to go downtown and we're going to go see it. We trekked that in for the burbs because we were like, how is this possible? Why are they showing this movie? But for some reason, when people talk about these kinds of films, Salò gets like held up automatically as artistic and it's intelligent and it's critiquing society. but Cannibal Holocaust generally gets like shunted into the bin of schlock gore.
Yeah.
Like, would you like to elaborate on like why you think maybe that division exists?
Well, some of it is the filmmaker. Remember, Salo was directed by Pasolini.
Mhm.
Pier Paolo Pasolini was a highly respected art house filmmaker. And in addition to being a filmmaker, he was also a poet and a political commentator and an academic. So he had this very high pedigree, and people were able to, and also he dealt in literary subjects. Remember, he
Mhm.
did adaptations of the Decameron and the Arabian Nights. Did a terrific, uh, for being an atheist communist, he did one of the great Jesus films, uh, which is the Gospel of St. Matthew. And yeah, so I think there was a whole respectability around him, which made on the one hand, he made these films that were about respectable academic subject matter. And at the same time, he made them in a way that was oftentimes outrageous. Some, if you've
To
seen
put
some
it
of the other
mildly.
films, the trilogy of life films were pretty outrageous. And then he became disillusioned and then made Salo, which was intended to be what is going to be called the trilogy of death, but Pasolini was murdered, and so he never made whatever would have been the other two films that would have accompanied Salo. But I think that partly accounts for why, and you could see Salo is part of the Criterion Collection,
Mhm.
um, which is generally taken as a sign of respectability and art house significance, whereas.
Yeah, when I heard that when I first heard about that, I was like, really, this movie where like they literally have shit eating? Like,
Mhm.
I'm like, this is making the Criterion Collection. But I mean, at the same time, like, what I think Michael Bay has two movies in the
Yes,
Criterion
that's
Collection.
the dirty little secret that Criterion doesn't want to talk about. That I don't think they've ever been released on a format since DVD, but yes, they put
Mhm.
out Armageddon and The Rock on Armageddon of all things on the Criterion. But that's something about Criterion that's not talked about as much, which is that filmmakers will approach them to add their films to the collection.
Really?
Yes. Remember, all of Wes Anderson's films get released by Criterion.
Hmm.
Um, the Irishman was immediately released on Criterion. So I think there was a brief time that Michael Bay was considered that he was going to be like the next Spielberg, and I think that was part of why those films got in the Criterion Collection, why they agreed to do them, and maybe or perhaps they just threw a ton of money at the Criterion Collection. I don't know exactly the gossip there. This is all speculation, but yes, two Michael Bay films are in the Criterion Collection.
I will say this in deference to him that it is surprisingly tricky to capture sort of like the cinematography of it. I mean, the content, that's one thing, but the way they look, that sort of like glossy, highly saturated, uh that there's something surprisingly tricky in the technical. I keep saying the same words over and over again. I write better than I speak,
Don't
but
we all?
like there is something like surprisingly difficult about making the look of a Michael Bay movie.
He is an
But
auteur.
yeah, yeah, you can tell right away that
Yeah,
it's one
and
of his films.
for you and people out there, if you've missed Ambulance, which is the film he made, I think 2 years ago,
Hmm.
it kind of got passed over at the box office at the time, but it's one of his best movies.
Hmm.
In fact, I would say it's one of the best action films probably released in the last, I don't know, 5 years. And that's because he knows how to use a camera.
Hmm. That's
And
very true.
specifically, he knows how to use drones in a way that was incredibly well deployed in Ambulance.
And kind of like to circle that back to what we're talking about, like I feel like when he is making an actual point about something, those are the films that tend to be a little more ignored. Like Pain and Gain is
Yes.
his film is a huge criticism, I think, about a lot of different things in society.
Hmm.
And it's probably one of his most ignored movies.
Yeah, it's
So
also one of his best.
yeah, so there we go. Um, so before we get into the content of your book,
Mhm.
Dissecting Cannibal Holocaust, saying the name as many times as possible for search engine
Thank you.
optimization. Um, so I think we've kind of got into like why you picked this movie. You saw something in it right
Yes.
away. So, what is my note here? Did you also feel like when you were putting this book together that that might help like um sort of illuminate the genre's ability to make culturally relevant statements? Like, was that part of the purpose with this book was not only to elevate Cannibal Holocaust, but bring up the genre as a whole? Because horror is very often disregarded as just nightmares and ghouls and so on and so forth.
Well, yes and no. I mean, horror actually has quite a bit of scholarship to it.
Mhm,
Um, I was thinking about this film in particular because of how interesting it is and how it's a text that people are aware of. A lot of people have Cannibal Holocaust has high name recognition.
mhm,
I can tell that I have a few Cannibal Holocaust t-shirts and I wear them out and about, and people be like, "Hey, wow," they recognize the name. And at the same time, I feel like there's not that much written about it, and there was a space there to say something and to say something substantive and provocative, which is indeed what I think the film does. Um, and I think in the popular press there is sometimes a disregard for horror. It was funny you mentioned Gene Siskel showing Cello, which is funny to me because if you're old enough to remember Siskel in the 80s,
oh yeah.
he and Ebert railed against the horror films being made at that time.
Mhm,
Um, and incidentally, I think Gene Siskel was a terrible film critic, but not just for that reason. But look at his other judgments about other
mhm.
films. Just look at the substance of his reviews, and I think they were not very good. But um, I think there had been a loss of respectability around the time the Cannibal Holocaust is made, right? In that period in the late 70s and then throughout the 80s. And that has to do with the indulgence of mechanical effects, the reliance on gore, and the catering towards a teenage audience, which I think oftentimes things that cater towards that audience tend to get dismissed. See Twilight, right?
Mhm.
Um, and uh, what I'd hoped to do was to get people to think not maybe not so much about horror, but about exploitation cinema and this kind of thing in a way that they maybe they wouldn't it wouldn't first occur to them to do. Because this goes back to what some of the first things you asked me. I think there is a stratification in the way that we engage with art. And I think there's an implication in the film, and I talk about this a bit in the book, that there is a capacity for uh, grindhouse or disreputable cinema to actually engage with the culture in ways that maybe respectable studio produced films can't. A good example of that is Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song,
Mhm.
right? There is a movie that is uh, made on the cheap by people who did not entirely know what they were doing. Uh, it is very much an exploitation film in the pure sense, which means that it has a hook that it's exploiting in order to gain an audience. But it also has an undeniable political message to it. And I think that that's also happening here in Cannibal Holocaust.
Um, One of the things I appreciate about this book is that it's really it's an accessible read. For any variety of reasons, every discipline has their own private vocabulary.
Mhm.
Not to mention, like sometimes academics have a tendency to use language to make themselves seem smarter, as smart as possible.
Yeah.
Um, but this book feels like it was written for a more general audience. Did you do that on purpose, or are you
Yes.
just a down to earth? Yeah, okay. I was gonna
Well,
say,
I would say that I'm in my other criticism, the stuff the film reviews that I write, I tend to do that in the same way to try and make people understand what it is I'm talking about. Is when I talk about the techniques of film and whatnot. But I also recognize the academic potential of this was not just going to be in film studies. It was going to appeal to people working in anthropology. It was going to appeal, I think, to some areas of philosophy, especially aesthetics. I think it was going to appeal to cultural studies, and I
I can
think,
definitely see that. Yeah.
and a variety of other areas, I think, and history also, social sciences, those kinds of things. I think and then of course various film studies and communication studies programs would also find this useful. So I had to write this in a way that would apply to those different disciplines.
Mhm.
At the same time, I also felt that um, the audience would for this book could go beyond academia, and that I think there would be a lot of interest by horror people, horror fans, the kind of people who will spend $50 on a Blu-ray might be interested in a book like this. Now, that gets to the price of the book. I wish the book was cheaper, but that's a decision made by the publisher, and that's the way that it is right now in hardcover. We'll see if down the line if there's a paperback version, or perhaps there is presently a electronic an ebook version, which is also considerably cheaper than the hardback.
Um, well, thank you for bringing it up, so I didn't have to. Because that is one of the stickier points with the book. It's a little tricky because it's like but that's not on you.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I have another response to that though, which is that if viewers out there are interested in reading this book, and the paper, the hardcover or the ebook are too expensive, I suggest you go to your local library and ask them to purchase a copy. I think our libraries are an underappreciated resource in a lot of our communities, but they fill a really important function. And so talk to your local librarian, tell them if you and your friends are interested, have all your friends, email the library and tell them, hey, we'd all be interested in reading this book. If you could please get us a copy. Um, and, also, if you want me to come by and talk about the book, I'm happy to do that as well. But yeah, I think the library is a good resource for these kinds of academic books that tend to be pricey because of the realities of the academic publishing marketplace.
well, there you go. There you go. So how long did it take to put this all together? Because this is clearly not like a 3 weekend with a six pack on the side
No, no, no,
situation.
no, no. Altogether, well, the proposal process was drawn out because I wrote this book partly during COVID. So that presented its own challenges in terms of doing research. I had to go to my local college library and use their databases. And because of COVID, that restricted my access to some of these things. But I think it was about 2.5 years from the time that they greenlit the proposal to the time that the book hit the shelves.
So when you were doing this copious amount of research for this book, because this is a thoroughly one of the things that's great about this book is that you have these really well structured, laid out arguments and perspectives.
Thank you.
So when people are reading it, they can see like the logic that leads to your conclusions. So whether or not they agree with you, they can at least see what built up these notions.
Right.
Was there ever an instance where you were doing the research and you were like, oh, I have to shift my perspective a little bit or something like that? Did you ever encounter something where it was like, oh, maybe I am thinking about this the wrong way?
A little bit. Well, one of them was a more of a factual issue, and that had to do with the claims of Cannibal Holocaust being believed to be a snuff film.
Mm.
Because initially I was working off, as far as the background of the making and release of the film, I was working off of the official making of documentary and the interviews that Deodato and others did, in which they talked about them being accused of murder. And then um, I watched this interview with the film scholar Eugenio Ercolani, who then suddenly reveals, oh, actually, he'd done the footwork. To his credit, he did a lot of the shoe leather reporting and looked into the court records and other official documents and found that that was probably nonsense. Um, I think the other part of it that was complicated that way was chapter 3, which is the culture chapter, and we talk about anthropology, and that ended up digging a whole can of worms. The native tribe depicted in the film are the Yanomama, and the I started initially thinking, okay, well, let's take a look at who these people actually are, and um, based on what anthropologists have found. Well, that ended up uncovering a whole drama that involved Napoleon Chagnon and other researchers who have been accused of all manner of things in the Amazon, some of which are true and some of which are not. And I talk about that at length in the book.
Mhm.
Um, but that made me rethink about, okay, I have to broaden this out a little bit to account for the way that anthropology actually fits into some of these themes, these recurrent master narratives about Native people and about the West's relationship to them. Um, I think the ethics chapter was one of the tougher ones to write too, and I had to think through that a bit as far as how I was gonna discuss this. Um, I think one of my other realizations, and this occurs in chapter three, was initially I thought, okay, this is about a clash of cultures, clash of civilizations, as to, to use a post 9/11 term. And uh, I think that the what I realized as I was going through this is that the real culture clash is not between uh, the native people and the Westerners. It's between one group of Westerners and another. It's between Monroe, the anthropologist and academic who values truth and integrity, and Alan Yates and the documentary filmmaking crew who believe the opposite of that. And so you have this sort of academic tradition and this corporate media tradition. Those are the things that are really butting heads and are
It-
contrasted in the film, whereas the natives are sort of the constant. They're similar in a way to some of the zombies in like a Romero zombie film in that respect.
mhm. That was one of the things too that I thought was interesting when you broke down in the film. We have these different representations of reality through media,
Mhm.
and it was kind of it's sort of like darkly humorous that there's a section of I'm gonna forget this off the top of my head because my brain is full of holes, but they show Yates has a previous series of films which are sort of like the Mondo documentaries,
Yes.
and like what they show is, if I remember correctly, it's an actual like Mondo documentary, but it's
Right.
fake, and but they play it in the film as if it's real. And I can kind of see where you're coming at with this like juxtaposition of like art versus reality and so
Mhm.
forth.
Yeah, you're talking about the last road to hell sequence. When they
That's
get
it.
back from the Amazon, Monroe is shown a previous documentary that the Yates crew made, and it's announced by the female network executive as being a put on.
Mm,
That no, they faked all this, and but in fact that footage is real, and it includes executions. That stuff's all real, um, and it creates an interesting tension where this stuff, which is in fact real, is being passed told is fake. And yeah, it creates and now that creates an interesting message later on, right? Because then we start seeing what Yates and company did behind the scenes of their portion of the film.
mhm,
And there's a really interesting use of music cue. So the crucified woman music, which is the music used for the impaled woman in the Green Inferno footage. It's the same music cue that they used during the last Road to Hell sequence. And I think what it implicitly suggests is that we should regard this footage as the same. It also suggests maybe what Yates did behind the scenes in order to get that footage from the last Road to Hell.
I hear you. I love that. I love little things like that, like little music cues that are
Yeah.
people don't always catch them, but I mean it's fascinating when you are aware of them.
Mhm.
Like for instance, I've always been captivated by the use of the was it the Deus Irae in Sweeney Todd. Like the entire musical is built around that single piece of music which everybody knows but doesn't
Mhm.
know. It's like right up there with Nessun Dorma, that like everybody's heard some interpretation of it. It's been in Star Wars, it's been in a number of
Mhm.
films, and it's become our cultural signifier for death musically. So I think it's fascinating when films do that, when they have these callbacks, because I think that people catch them they don't realize it, but I think it's hitting them subconsciously.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm glad that that's in the film. I'm glad that you bring it up too, because you point it out.
Mhm.
Um, so I already answered that question. Um, that's one of the things I've discovered as I've been doing interviews lately, is that sometimes folks have a peculiar ability to answer things before I have to ask them.
Mhm.
Um, when you were working on this, was there ever a point where you had to tell yourself, like, I gotta stop. I have enough material to prove my point. Now it's time to like compose this whole thing. Like you could go on for a long time about, like, for instance, you have a lot of stuff about like the literary history of like jungle adventures and like Pulp Fiction and how that informs motion pictures, and then that ties into cultural norms and so on and so forth, how they're
Yeah.
influenced by colonialism. But like, was there like over a point where you were like, okay, I have enough material to prove my point? Or did you, where's the, would you lead us through that, is what I'm getting
Yeah,
at.
sure. So this was my first book.
Mm.
So it's the first time I've written anything this of this length that was this complicated. And I think what I ended up doing was going through the book in passes. So I kind of outlined what the chapter would be, and then I identified, okay, here's general topics I need to go research. And so I did research on those, and then I worked on it long enough that I could create a draft of that chapter, hitting all the points. And then I'd note where I kind of had holes. And then I would go back, I'd do more research, and I'd go back and fill those holes wherever the gaps were in the research. And then go on and write the next chapter. And then do the same thing. And then take a trip to the library and get a bunch of research and then fill those holes. And then try and create a full draft of the book. And then go back and then going through it again. Okay, this needs more development. This needs more evidence, and just trying to strengthen sections where they needed to be, uh, needed more supports, or fleshing out ideas that maybe I didn't realize were important. And then I see, and once I see the whole book together, um, I realized that certain ideas emerge as being more important than others.
Um, mhm. So you do, like I said, there's a really interesting exploration of how uh, there's a tradition of like
Mhm.
colonialism informing the stories that we tell. What, in your opinion, is like the reason why we keep telling these same stories over and over again? Because you don't just talk about up to Cannibal Holocaust in the book, you also bring it up to contemporary
Yeah.
films and some literature and so forth. But there's a demonstrable thread
Yeah.
running throughout films and stories that we have been telling for at least the 20th century, like the
Mhm.
modern era from roughly like the 1880s up until now. Um, that seems consistent, but
Yes.
what are your thoughts on why we keep doing that?
Well, I think the cynical part of me says because nothing has changed. And that's being a bit facetious. But I think there's some truth in that there's core issues that we're still trying to resolve. Um, Colonialism has come and gone, and yet, or at least colonialism as we know it has come and gone, and yet exploitation and domination certainly remain, right? We just saw that recently with Chevron uh, and the problems they've had, and as well as Chiquita, the lawsuits that have been filed and fought over their shenanigans in South America, to put it lightly, funding death squads. And
Uh,
uh, and I think that there's something in that we need to that in the way that the first world and the third world, or the developing world and the industrialized world, to relate to one another, that we're still having to negotiate with, right? And then I think there's something deeper too, that is perhaps um, cosmic or feral in at the same time. Some very intimate about what we see in Cannibal Holocaust and some of the central issues being explored there, about the nature of mankind, about our relationship to nature and the natural world, and some of those related issues that perhaps will always be with us.
So that kind of leads me into your breakdown of nature was very fascinating to me. I've never seen it personally. I've never seen it broken down quite that much in this particular way, but it made complete sense to me. Um, would you like to walk us through that a little bit? Like, how did you discover these? Like you talk about the Disneyfication of it,
Mhm.
and then you also talk about. I love the inclusion of Werner Herzog, basically as a
Mhm.
perspective of like a stand-in for a more nihilistic take on, nature just doesn't care about us.
Yeah.
And I can't recall off the top of my head, and I'm not going to try to page through the book and find it, but there was there was the Disneyfication, there was another one, and then there was sort of the nihilistic take on it. Would you like to lead
Right.
us through how you came to these?
Sure. So that chapter, what I was really interested in exploring was the mankind's relationship to nature as depicted in Cannibal Holocaust. And how does this relate to the way that the rest of mainstream culture depicts that issue? Because that's a recurring thing throughout the book, which is, how do we portray Native people? How do we portray nature? How do we portray capitalism? That kind of thing. How do we portray the news media? All those sorts of different dimensions. So in the case of nature, what I wanted to address is how have we often thought about it? And so I talk actually about Aldo Leopold and his views of the biota, and how that is somewhat at odds with some of the more mainstream views of nature. So when the most significant voice in at least Americans' conception of nature is probably Disney.
Mhm.
And I talk about particularly The Lion King. I think there's other films you could talk about there as well, such as the Jungle Book and Bambi. But Lion King is the one that enunciates the Disneyfication of nature most explicitly, in the Circle of Life song, and the way that issue is presented in the film. And it's one in which is contradictory because on the one hand, there's an acknowledgement in the Circle of Life idea that animals prey upon one another, right? But it also uh, omits any of the violence that is inherent in that predation. And so it's this very sanitized view of nature. Now, you brought up Werner Herzog, and one of his great films is, of course, Grizzly Man, about Timothy
Mhm.
Treadwell, the ecologist who went out and lived among the bears and then was eventually killed by them. And it's clear from watching that documentary and Treadwell's interviews with himself and his interaction with the bears that he had a very Disneyfied notion of the world and of nature and did not recognize the danger that he was in, and maybe couldn't because of this notion of nature in which animals live together in relative harmony in a way that resembles our idealized notion of human society. Um, Now, in between there's I talk about two other important figures. One of them is nature documentaries, and here again we talk about Disney because Disney has a whole branch of documentaries that they've put out,
Mhm.
and some of those have been extremely dishonest, namely White Wilderness, which incidentally won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, but has a scene of lemmings leaping off a cliff. And we now know that those lemmings were, in fact, pushed off the cliff by the filmmakers.
Mhm.
Uh,
Which has led
other,
to the whole myth of lemmings
Mhm.
running off a cliff.
Yes,
So,
right. And the other documentarian I talk about are the BBC documentaries, often narrated by David Attenborough. And these are certainly not as egregious as some of the Disney films, but they do try to impose narratives on nature. And they do try to sanitize nature in a way. But perhaps more importantly, they don't portray nature and human beings as existing in the same sphere, right? In fact, in a lot of those Attenborough documentaries, human beings are off screen completely. This was noted in a review of their one of their Africa documentaries that they left out a critical element in their documentary of Africa, which was Africans.
Africans.
you know. And so it depicts nature as this human free being free zone. And I think this is really unhelpful because it recognizes in a sense it distorts an essential truth about nature, which is that we live in it. There, and one of the implicit messages of Cannibal Holocaust is there is no distinction. We are animals, and animals are us, which is part of the function, I think, of the animal killings that exist in the film, but also the parallelism of predation, the way that human beings prey upon each other and prey upon the animals, and the way that, in some cases, animals prey upon human beings.
Um,
And then you mentioned the Herzog films, and the Herzog has obviously this very different view of nature, that the world is not a cuddly place. But Herzog nevertheless does seem to uphold that division between human beings and nature that Cannibal Holocaust seeks to collapse.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, because we do always have that separation, and you're right. That was the thing about the second one. I've always been irritated by those BBC documentaries because they do create a narrative as if there's a purpose other than instinct to what's
Yeah,
going on with animals.
they do. And
Um,
they've been known to staple together different animals at different times and places in order to construct that narrative. I mean,
so
what
again, it's
what
a
they're doing
completely
is
false.
is not nearly as egregious as some of the stuff that Shark Week has done, which I wish I had had the space to include that in the book, but at some point I had to cut some things out. But some of the Shark Week documentaries, which have been really egregious and outright dishonest in the way that they have hinted that the megalodon shark still exists, which it doesn't. Um, or even there was that documentary, Mermaids, which people started calling up scientists and complaining, like, why are you hiding the mermaids from us? We're not, man. Mermaids don't exist. But this stuff is being put out there by what are ostensibly documentary platforms, and this stuff is bullshit.
But the downside is that it brings in viewers and it
Mhm.
attracts people to the channel. And so
Yeah.
you do one thing about prehistoric sharks still being alive. Now you got to go on to mermaids, and then where does it stop? It starts to
Mhm.
sort of which is something we've already seen with the History Channel. Their
Sure.
downward spiral into just all kinds of different notions of reality. That I have a degree in history, so me
Oh,
watching the History Channel's descent um, has been something of a I don't know, like a guilty pleasure over the years. Just
mhm.
like what are you doing? What are you doing? You know,
Mhm.
we used to joke back in the day. We used to joke it was the Hitler channel
Right. Because of the
because
big H.
whenever, yeah, well, mainly because of the fact that whenever their ratings were down, they would do like a massive spike in World War II stuff because
Yeah.
there's footage because it's got more drama, and then
Mhm.
they would just be like days and days on end of just like was Hitler on meth? Was so on and so forth. And there's evidence to suggest Hitler was on meth. And then there was like
Really?
they did an entire one about what was his actual voice because we only have recordings of him screaming in speeches. What was his casual voice? And it's an hour of people putting this together until they've got an actor doing an impression of him, and they're like, "This is our historical basis for Hitler's soft-spoken speech." And you're like,
Okay.
why are we doing this? This is
Mhm.
completely fabricated. And now it's like aliens and so on and so forth. And it's
Yeah.
just, but it's a ratings ploy.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that kind of ties back in with Cannibal Holocaust because then you have these corporate individuals who are like, we should just put this out anyway. We know that this
Mhm.
is egregious. We know this is fake,
Yeah.
but it's captivating. It tells a story and it depicts these savages the way that we
Mhm.
expect them to be. So
Yes.
like it sort of all feeds into this whole like notion of like capitalism will ignore the truth in favor of a profitable product.
Yeah. Well, they're all media is built, it exists within a capitalist system, and it has to generate profit. And you do that by generating views and clicks. I mean, this is not new. We didn't invent this here on the spot, but it continues to be a relevant critique. Um, and some of the themes of Cannibal Holocaust and the discussion about savagery certainly is still relevant to depictions of, for example, the wars going on right now between Israel and Hamas, and the headlines that espouse from there with use of words like savage, barbaric, or even the violence of our inner cities. And when a few years ago, when there was the Black Lives Matter riots, um, the way that those events were portrayed, you know, definitely did feed into an ongoing master narrative about our expectations, and I mean our in terms of the culture's expectations of people of color.
Mm. Um, and on a note of like expectations and so on and so forth, even though, like I said, you have well laid out arguments for people, there's still a possibility that people are not going to necessarily agree with your interpretations. Like
I'm
you
sure.
expect that,
Yes.
down the line. But at the same time, like especially I think like the section on ethics,
Mhm.
because like you talk about this film has unsimulated animal killings, and that's
Yes.
that's something people are going to react to very emotionally,
Mhm. Yeah.
and uh but I feel at the same time like you have this expectation, because I remember there were a couple of passages in there where you're anticipating people are going to disagree with you, but that kind of feels like part of what this book is. It's also an invitation for people to
Yeah.
similarly, in the same sort of scholarly manner,
Mhm.
uh, present their own opinions. Don't
Yeah.
just be like, no, I disagree with this nerd and throw the book away. Like, actually think about why you disagree with somebody and construct a cogent argument, I think would be the right
Mhm.
way to put that.
Well, I think writing's a conversation, and that's true of all sorts of writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. You're engaging with the reader, and you're also engaging with the people who have written on this topic already. And I kind of engaged with that deliberately and wanted to suggest that other areas where people could do research. I tried to present my arguments as well as I could, but also anticipate that people would have objections to them, and try to respond to some of those preemptively. But yeah, I hope that the book prompts, and this gets back to some of the stuff we talked about at the beginning. I hope the book prompts people to think about their entertainment, but also maybe their dismissal of certain other kinds of entertainment. What does qualify for scholarship? Uh, I don't think we have to throw out texts that are in the canon, but I do think that there's room for more stuff. And we've been seeing that happen in terms of diversity, where people of color and women are getting, who have been otherwise ignored by the canon, are now being included. And for the most part, that's a good thing. And it depends too what you think the canon is for, incidentally. But I think that there's also a way of opening this up in terms of genres, and there's a kind of an implicit class suggestion here, uh, because this a film like Cannibal Holocaust and others are kind of presumed to entertain kind of a lowbrow audience,
Mm.
and for that reason they've been kind of dismissed. I mentioned earlier, a lot of horror, appeals to a teenage audience, which oftentimes is dismissed as just schlock and disposable. Um, but this film does more than that. I think it's a more interesting film than a lot of film pictures that have won Academy Awards recently, for example.
Well, there you go. I don't want to get into too much of the different content in here because I want people to read the book. But I think that we've covered a lot of the bases on what makes this interesting, what makes this compelling. Um, you already mentioned you have a podcast radio show,
Yes,
um,
Sounds of Cinema.
Sounds of Cinema. I will make sure to put a link of some kind in the description
Great.
so people can find out about that. And then, so what does the future hold? I mean, I know that you've just completed this big project, and I know what it's like to finish a big project, believe me.
Mhm.
And like the last thing you want to do is think about work. But do you have some idea where you're going to go next?
Well, in terms of writing, I'll keep writing. I mean, I keep producing the show, keep reviewing things. I'm still plugging the book and trying to get it on people's radar. I think the next thing I mentioned that my degree was in creative writing, and so I think the next thing I want to do is a novel. I have some ideas that I've been working on, but we'll see where we go from here.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
If there's anything else that you want to get into about the book or something like that, if I haven't gotten to it, anything specific, feel free to bring it up.
No, I think we've pretty well covered it.
All right. Well, in that case, once again, thank you for your time and glad to have you.
Okay, thank you very much.